अस्सलाम वालेकुम फ्रेंड्स, कैसे मिजाज हैं आप लोगों के। उम्मीद करता हूँ बिल्कुल ठीक हो गए। थैंक यू सो मच फॉर लाइकिंग द वीडियोस। डोंट फॉरगेट टू सब्सक्राइब इफ यू हैवंट। अच्छा, जो आज शख्सियत हमारे साथ हैं, अगेन इट्स अ ग्रेट ऑनर टू हैव हिम ओवर हियर। ही इज currently doing MPhil in International Relations from University of Karachi. Have also been the head of research unit in Model OIC. You remember we had a chat in Model OIC 2 in one of the video. So you can easily recall this organization too. So, and he has done his CSS as well. So let me take this privilege to welcome Mr. Tabish Sarfaraz. Assalamu alaikum Tabish, क्या हाल है?
Walaikum assalam. I'm doing good. Thank you very much for having me, Waqar.
It's my pleasure. First of all, how do you feel coming onto this platform?
It's an immense honor that you would have me on your show and on your channel. You're doing a commendable job, and may you be blessed with more success and more subscriber, and may you continue to invite people on interesting topics.
So
It's a
nice
huge,
of
huge
you.
honor. It's a huge honor.
So nice of you. So pleasure is always mine. अच्छा जी, आज जो हम बात करेंगे ताबिश, it's also a very important topic, especially when it comes to the world level. क्योंकि
Mhm.
हमने देखा था कि सेकेंड वर्ल्ड वॉर के बाद यूनाइटेड नेशन गॉट स्टैब्लिश्ड, तो सबको ये लगता था कि यूएन इज समथिंग जहाँ पे इट कैन बी रिप्रेजेंटेटिव ऑफ ईच एंड एवरी कंट्री. But before going into the details, I want you to speak a bit about the fundamentals on which this organization was formed.
All right. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Your question is very pertinent because many students of social sciences or international relations or general knowledge per se do not really understand that how UN came into being. And to understand the foundations of UN, you need to understand the theoretical perspectives of institutional liberalism. And I'll repeat that again for the audience: institutional liberalism. It's also called internationalism as well, liberal internationalism as well. The founder of which, by many scholars, is considered to be U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, who established the League of Nations after the First World War based on his 14 points. These are not the 14 points of Quaid-e-Azam. These are the 14 points of Woodrow Wilson. Basically, this theoretical perspective posits that war can be avoided through international cooperation, through a neutral international organization which upholds the values of international law, democracy, cooperation, disarmament, and through a concentrated and combined coordinated effort of the nations of the world against any form of tyranny, oppression, or unjust war. And this was the concept that laid the foundation of League of Nations, which, as we know through history, League of Nations failed, and which resulted in the Second World War. But during the Second World War, this is again a misconception or maybe a lack of knowledge that immediately that Second World War ended and suddenly UN was formed. Excuse me. This is not so. During the Second World War, U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who is commonly known by his initials FDR, and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill met in Nova Scotia in Canada in 1941, and they gave a joint declaration which is known as the Atlantic Charter. And 26 countries at that time approved of this charter, and this was the first major initiative leading towards what we now know as the United Nations organizations. Then in 1943, there were two conferences, the Moscow Conference and the Tehran Conference. These were attended by the big three, which were the US, the UK, and the USSR. And the Soviets were promised they would be given a role in the post-Second World War world order, and that the US will provide them weapons as well via Iran for their fight against the Nazis. The Moscow and Tehran conferences were attended by the foreign ministers of the three countries. USSR was represented by Molotov, the UK by Foreign Minister Eden, and the Secretary of State Hull for the United States were present. This led to the Dumbarton Oaks conference in 1944. This was held in the United States and was attended by US, China, USSR, and UK, basically the four of the P5, and they sent delegations, and proposals were submitted, and draft charter of the UN was formed. and the rough sketch of UN structure was agreed upon. Then came the fourth and final conference, known as the San Francisco Conference in 1945, and all the details were finalized in this conference in April. 46 countries initially participated, and they agreed to uphold the UN Charter. There were a total of 282 official delegates. English and French were adopted as working language. Chinese, Russian, Spanish, and Arabic were considered as official language. And on 24th October 1945, in New York City, United Nations came into being as a fully functional supranational organization.
I think that is a very thorough and brief description about the historic value of this organization. Let me quickly ask you this about its three main organs, which are, I think, General Assembly and Security Council. What was the significance of that?
Okay, so basically there are six organs of the United Nations. But for all instances and purposes, the focus always has been and should always be, from a scholarly point of view, on the workings of the Security Council. Before I go into the Security Council, the General Assembly is of great value, considering the fact that General Assembly has the representation of all the states in the world, those who have been agreed into the membership of the United Nations, and they each state is allowed to send 5 representatives on the General Assembly floor, and every nation has 1 vote. And it meets every September, the 3rd Tuesday of every September. That means the coming month, we will be having the General Assembly session of the UN. And basically, it has ordinary and supervising functions. And of all the agencies that the UN has, you talked about UNESCO and ECOSOC before starting this program with me. And what are its functions basically? UN, everything that the General Assembly does is pending approval of the Security Council. So the main authoritative body is the Security Council, not the General Assembly. For example, new members are to be admitted into the UN. The General Assembly approves it, send it to Security Council. When Security Council says it's okay, then those new members come in. Similarly, the election of the judges of ICJ, that is International Court of Justice, again, General Assembly sends it, Security Council vetoes it or approves it, then it's approved. Then it is approved. Similarly, the appointment of the Secretary General, is done on the suggestion of the Security Council. The budgetary approval and amendment and revision of the charter are all under the domain of the General Assembly, but they go through to the Security Council. So any resolution that passes the General Assembly with, let's say, even 100% consensus, goes back to the Security Council, where the permanent 5 have the veto, and that can be vetoed. So you will see a multitude of General Assembly resolutions being defeated in the Security Council.
Yes, I think one more thing it's quite significant about this veto issue. For instance, the countries who have got the veto power, at least 4 of them or 5 of them agrees, but one says that veto. So that issue is completely gone out of the equation. Why is that so?
Exactly, it is like that because the permanent 5 members were all given equal status. So there was no one superior. The majority was not superior to 1 veto. Earlier, there's again a misconception that all P5 members were nuclear powers. That came later. The P5 were the victorious countries of the Second World War, who later acquired weapons of mass destruction or nuclear weapons. So 1945 US, 1948 USSR, in the 50s it was France and the UK, then in 1960s it was China, and then after China acquired nuclear weapons, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is known as the NPT, was put in force, whereby no other state could acquire nuclear weapons. And because Pakistan and India are not signatories of NPT, and North Korea as well, who was earlier a signatory but then revoked it, went back on its claim on its stance of acquiring weapons. So otherwise, P5 would have been expanded into have P6, P7, possibly even P8, if the only circumstance or the only condition was to have nuclear weapons. It's not so. It is the victors of the Second World War who were having the permanent 5 status. And incidentally, the PRC, that is People's Republic of China, did not have a seat at the Security Council. It was Republic of China, which we now know as Taiwan, because USA supported non-communist Taiwan against the People's Republic of China up until 1970. And when the relations between the two countries improved in the 70s during the presidency of Richard Nixon, that's when People's Republic of China got the permanent seat in replacement of Republic of China, which is Taiwan.
Absolutely. And I think this veto wala system, at times people are not able to say whether it's justified or just or unjust, because even one country, if use it, the rest, no matter whatever they have done, it goes completely in vain. So do you think it's a justified issue? Justified thing?
See, from my standpoint, I would say that using any notion of moral ethical standards, of course, it's not justified, because you have resolutions that pass through the General Assembly floor on Kashmir, you have them on Palestine, and they get defeated on the Security Council agenda. However, we understand from a theoretical perspective that although the UN is created in the name of liberalism and equality and fraternity and cooperation, the functioning of the Security Council is, of course, on the best of days, it is still operating under the realist ideology, which means that states will, of course, put their national interest first when it comes to Security Council resolutions. You will see that even though Security Council did not allow the US to invade Iraq, US still went ahead and did it, and UN was on the sidelines standing and was unable to do anything. And even though General Assembly has passed many resolutions on Palestine and on Kashmir, on Rohingya crisis, they hold no value until and unless the Security Council approves on it unanimously. Now, unanimously in the Security Council is a big problem, because of all the 5, 3 are always in opposition of one or another. So you have the historical fight between the United States and Soviet Union, and now what we know as Russia. And then US and China are ideologically opposed because of capitalism and communism. Then you have the intricate balance of alliances that each have with one another. So on certain issues, Russia might veto that China will agree to. On certain issues, China will veto on what Russia will agree to. Where Russia and China agree, maybe US will veto. US vetoes most of the time. It has used the veto the most amount of time on very sensitive issues, particularly on the issue of Palestine and Israel. And it is mired. The UN Security Council is mired by national interest and by policies of each permanent 5 looking after its own interests.
I think this is the main reason why the binding resolution of the UN are still to be taken into the account. For instance, Kashmir, Palestine, Israel, and many other issues which are even somehow or the other approved but are still not in the practical as yet. Let's discuss a little about the role of UN over the last 7 decades almost. Do you think that on the fundamentals which it was formed, especially the organizations like UNESCO, which you have just pointed out, is it justified? Is it something which they should have done, are doing?
Okay, so before I go into the answer of that, we need to understand what are the purposes of the formation of UN. UN number one aim is, or its number one mandate is to maintain international peace and security. That's its number one aim. Then it comes into develop friendly relations amongst nations. to achieve international cooperation on economic, social, cultural, and humanitarian levels, promoting respect for human rights and fundamental rights, and Center for Harmonizing International Actions. Now, on all 5 of these accounts, UN has categorically failed at one or the other. So UN's first involvement as an international mediator or for international peace was the Korean War, which began in 1950. And technically, the Korean War is still going on because there has not been a peace treaty between the North and the South. What is holding them is an armistice, which is temporary ceasefire. Under its legal terminology, armistice means that there's temporary ceasefire. So if we take it under technical or legal terms, North Korea and South Korea are still technically at war. So failed there. It has failed to stop humanitarian crises in Yugoslavia in the 90s. The Srebrenica massacre happened. The perpetrators were caught, later tried. They are now serving sentences, but the justice delayed is justice denied, my friend. Different problems in Africa, from famine to ethnic warfare, Ethiopia, Sudan, Somalia, Sierra Leone, the issue of conflict diamonds, humanitarian crisis right now going on in Yemen, in Syria, the plight of Muslims in Rohingya, the plight of Muslims in Palestine, in Kashmir. Issues of Cyprus are in consideration in the UN for a long, long time. That the issues relating to Crimea, the Russian annexation was brought, did not get resolved. There are so many instances of peace, security, cooperation, humanitarian aid, educational aid that the UN has failed at time and time again, that the question remains that is it just a face or is it just an organization that is there just for the sake of it? And or is it going to serve some level of function? The debate can be said that UN peacekeeping force, where they have been deployed, they have managed to have some level of control. Some incidents in Africa are noted, and that's about it. I mean, what it has achieved over this last 70 years against what it has failed to achieve, it's a huge imbalance. It's a huge imbalance in the fact that UN has provided excellent discourse, lip service, or statements for stopping wars, war criminals, or humanitarian crisis, but practically has its hand tied because all of its actions need to come through the Security Council, which is dominated by the P5 and their national interest, rather than coming from the General Assembly, where the majority of the states and the will of the nation of states is present.
Absolutely, and I think that 8 or 9 goals which are usually being seen as goal of the millennium are unfortunately not achieved by the UN too, and
Indeed.
that is perhaps the main reason that they are governed by some states, not the representation of the rest of the countries. That is perhaps the main reason it has failed. Now, before we end, Tavish, what is their role in the pandemic, the current situation? Are they actually making substance effort into that?
One thing that comes from the top of my mind about the UN and the COVID-19 pandemic is I think couple of months ago, there was a press conference of the WHO, which stated that asymptomatic carriers of COVID-19 are not a threat to spread the disease. Now, this came 2 months or 3 months after there were virtual lockdown across the globe, in which everyone was feeling threatened against COVID-19. And this information that asymptomatic carriers were not a threat to spread the virus would have helped many a nation, particularly developing and underdeveloped nations, to keep their economies running and to keep their societal order running. And now this is 3 months late. Why was this information released late? There are certain reasons. I'm sure research was being done to find out if asymptomatic carriers can transmit or not transmit. But once again, when you're at a position of power at a level of UN and the world is looking at you, then you need to make immediate access to information and accurate access to information, immediate and access to accurate information rather, that would help the people of the world, particularly the underdeveloped and the developing nations. As far as China's role goes in the UN or in the WHO, I think it's a lot of US rhetoric against China and it's China's rise, because Trump and US policy are failing in their own backyard, in their own country, and their global eminence is under threat, particularly by China and also by the rise of multipolarity. So their conspiracy theories have always existed. China spread the virus, or US has spread the virus. I think what we know for a fact is that COVID-19 caught everyone off guard. No one was prepared for it. And what made the situation worse was the fact that UN and agencies were not hands-on in dealing with it, either in their own backyard, that is the Western world, or in any other countries or in any other regions. They were not able to provide accurate support or timely support to help combat the situation.
Absolutely, absolutely. Tavish, before we conclude this, another very important thing coming into my mind, because I just read a few research about a couple of months ago that these organizations like WHO, FAO, WTO, and the other world organizations, they are pretty much at stake. Is it so?
Because of this pandemic? Pardon, can you repeat the last part?
These organizations, by many people, many researchers, because of this pandemic, are their stake. I mean, their you can say importance or their their role will never be as it was when this pandemic will be over.
See, one of the problems with the UN and its specialized agencies are like FAW, WTO, WHO. These are specialized agencies that work under the General Assembly and different committees of the General Assembly. One of the main problems with UN and its effectiveness is budgetary control. First of all, UN's budget is less than that of New York City, which will surprise you and surprise many of the hearers. Listeners. Secondly, states and state sovereignty, how much can the UN impose its will upon states who are sovereign nations and who, by the UN's own charter, state sovereignty is supreme. So there's a clash. How much influence does the UN have on independent and individual states, which allow it to function or not to function? And then how much can the UN exert itself on the sovereignty of other states? By UN, I mean UN in itself and its specialized agencies, whether it be WTO, WHO, or any other specialized agencies. So yes, they are working, but they're working in a very limited capacity. States so far do hold the supreme power in international order, and their sovereignty is maintained not only by their own will, but by international law as well. And this is a kind of dichotomy of UN, that it wants to function within the paradigm of state sovereignty, but state sovereignty is something that no state is willing to give up, even an inch of it. So it is caught in a rock and a hard place, basically.
Absolutely, Tabish. It's been a pleasure talking to you. And I know it's a topic which requires plenty more discussion, but obviously in this short period of time, we tried our best to cover its, the fundamentals which we should have, talked about. So thank you so much, Tabish, and I'll definitely keep inviting you to talk about this topic again too. And I'm sure our audience must have learned a lot from this discussion. And if you haven't subscribed to my channel, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share, because this information can only be worth when it will be spread far and wide. So don't forget to share this video. Take great care of yourself. Allah Hafiz and stay curious.